Great Lakes Prepping here. Well, the time has come to finally process and can all my tomatoes for the year. It may seem odd that I've waited until November to do this, but there's a good reason. I like to do all my tomatoes all at once in one big batch. And because tomatoes grow and become ripe all throughout the season, that means I have to freeze them until it's time to can. By the end of the season, that pretty much means that one of my freezers is bursting at the seams with tomatoes. Now, as the weather starts to turn cold, I pick every last tomato from the vine, no matter how unripe they may be. And there are a lot of tomatoes still on the vine that I don't want to waste. So I bring them inside, put them in paper bags, and wait until they're ripened. The last of my tomatoes turned red just a couple weeks ago. So that means it's finally time to get to work. So in this video, I'm going to show you how I process them into tomato puree to end up with the thickest sauce without having to simmer them on the stove for 20 hours. And rather than making and canning pasta sauce, barbecue sauce, pizza sauce, or any other finished product, I like to can pure tomato puree so that I can use it later on when I decide to make something that calls for it. Tomato puree is known as passata in Italy, and it's used as the starting point for all manner of tomato-based sauces. While store-bought passata usually comes in these funny-looking tapered bottles, homemade passata is sealed and stored in, you guessed it, mason jars. And that's exactly what we're going to do here today. So let's get started! This year, I grew mostly San Marzano tomatoes, which are considered by many to be the gold standard for sauce tomatoes. I also had a couple of beefsteak plants, and a bunch of those ended up in the freezer as well. In total, I've got exactly 60 pounds of tomatoes here. After taking them out of the freezer bags and putting them in these food-grade buckets, I let them thaw all day and night. Some of the tomatoes at the bottom were still a bit frozen, so I thawed them the rest of the way in some warm water on the stove. A huge advantage of freezing and subsequently thawing tomatoes for passata making is that they become a bit mushy and the peels fall right off. This eliminates the need for blanching, and it also starts to release a lot of water from the tomatoes, which is my ultimate goal anyway. Once the tomatoes are completely thawed, they're going right into my Victorio food strainer machine. Lots of people simmer their tomatoes first, but my method doesn't require this. Room temperature tomatoes go right into the machine. And while the hand crank works perfectly fine, I prefer to use my power drill adapter that I made for much easier and faster straining. Since the tomatoes are soft and the peels are barely attached from the freezing and thawing, this machine has absolutely no problem. As you can see, the tomato puree comes out this little plastic ramp, and everything else, basically skins and seeds, comes out of the tube on the side. If you process a lot of tomatoes, I really can't recommend this machine enough. And they do make an electric motor attachment for this machine, but frankly, my power drill is faster. And if you want to check out the Victorio food strainer machine for yourself, I'll put a link to it in the video description. From 60 pounds of tomatoes, I ended up with around 4.5 gallons of puree and a big old pile of skins and seeds. Once my tomatoes have all gone through the machine, now's the time to simmer. Heating up all of this tomato puree is going to help separate the water from the tomato even further. I don't simmer for an especially long time, maybe about 15 minutes. The next part is where the real magic happens. This is where I end up with my super thick, beautiful passata. Using this large mesh bag, which is actually sold as beer brewing equipment, I'm going to basically drain the puree. I'll put the bag in a large pot and carefully pour in all the puree. Then as I slowly begin lifting it out of the pot, you can see that a ton of water pours out of it. Now it's just a matter of deciding how thick you want your passata to be. The longer you let it drain, the thicker it'll be, and the more tired your arms will get. I actually went a little overboard on this step today, so I ended up mixing a little bit of that tomato water back in. And if you're surprised by how much liquid versus puree I ended up with, I sure was too the first time I did this. But don't worry that I've drained a ton of flavor out of the sauce. Even though this liquid is red and could certainly qualify as tomato juice, it's still very thin and pretty light in color. It has a little tomato flavor, but not anywhere even close to the rich flavor of my drained passata. That being said, I'm still going to can a bunch of the juice. While not nearly as thick or flavorful as store-bought tomato juice, this liquid still comes in handy when I'm making soups, particularly soups that call for any combination of water and tomatoes. Now the last thing I do before canning is give the passata a quick once-over with the Immersion Blender. This just helps make it a little smoother, which is exactly how I want it. And now it's time to can. The canning process is the same as any tomato sauce. I'll start by putting a half teaspoon of citric acid in each quart jar, then fill the jars with sauce, debubble, and wipe the rims. Add the lids and rings, and they're ready for the canner. Repeat these steps for the tomato juice. I realize it might seem crazy that I've only ended up with 4 quarts of passata from 60 pounds of tomatoes, but in fairness, this stuff is very thick. If you only strain it enough to end up with sauce that's roughly the consistency of, say, store-bought Prego, you might get more like 6 or 7 quarts out of it. But I like starting off with a very thick puree, because my recipes that use it tend to call for other liquids. For example, my pasta sauce involves adding red wine and oil, both of which will thin it out. Starting off with a pretty thick puree, I won't need to add any tomato paste. The quart jars of tomato puree and juice will process for 40 minutes. I want to do these all at once, so I'm using my regular hot water bath canner as well as my pressure canner. Note that I am not pressure canning these, but simply using it as a second hot water bath canner. As always, once the jars have finished processing, I'll set them on towels on the counter and leave them alone for many hours until completely cooled. After a few minutes, I'll start hearing each lid pop, which means that jar is sealed. If any of these lids do not seal, I can attempt to reprocess them with a new lid, or simply put that jar in the fridge and use it within about a week. So this has been my method for making and canning the thickest, non-runny tomato passata without spending an entire day simmering and stirring. Be sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future canning videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, this is Great Lakes Prepping.